Before we begin, I should, first of all, in addition to welcoming you, and should I perhaps tell you that because this is one of those rare events in which more people have arrived than said they would, we're ordering a few more chairs, and I apologize for those who are in the meantime, discomforted. If there's anyone from the diplomatic corps here, we have a front row reserved for you. If you find yourself, well, whether or not you find yourself without a seat. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming. My name is John O'Sullivan. I'm the president of the Danube Institute. And this is an event which has obviously excited a great deal of attention. And of course, for the last 3.5 years, people in this part of the world have been paying attention to what was happening in British politics with more than usual attentiveness because Brexit is important not only obviously to the British people but also to the peoples of Europe in one way or another. And although the referendum returned a narrow but clear result, the prospects for Brexit have since then been uncertain. It did seem, now it does seem, that this election might resolve these questions, and that, as I say, it does seem to be the case, though we'll come on to it. Our guest who's going to explain these things is a distinguished journalist and political publisher and activist, I think it's fair to say, Tim Montgomerie. Tim is most famous, I think, for having started what has become the first major influential political website, I think. He went to the United States following the last major defeat of the Conservatives in namely Tony Blair's 1997 victory, and he researched what had been done and accomplished by the people on the right and the people in the Republican Party and the wider conservative movement in establishing institutions that formed and helped to shape a conservative public opinion. And that, it seemed, was lacking in Britain, and I agree with him. There were major newspapers, like my old ones, The Telegraph, or magazines like The Spectator, but there was no grassroots organization of the kind that the conservative movement enjoyed in America. It was essentially confined to the Conservative Party, and it was clear that in modern politics that was not going to be enough. And so he started the conservative website, Conservative Home. It has since become itself a major power in politics, which the Conservative Party has to pay attention to almost as much as the Conservative Home website pays attention to it. So that was Tim's entry into this world. Secondly, he then left and became a political journalist. He was, I think your title would have been Associate Editor on the Times, and he has since moved into new areas as well. In fact, a particularly interesting one, since I think your present status is unofficial, but you have been, and presumably will become again, an advisor to Boris Johnson in Downing Street, on what is now, of course, the central topic of British politics, which is what is the Conservative government of Boris Johnson going to make of the new Conservative electorate that seems to have emerged in a way that wasn't the case beforehand. We now have a very different electorate which voted Conservative. We have a whole series of other impacts of this election. We have turmoil in the Labour Party, what may become, or may not, a major civil war in that party. We have the development of a constitutional crisis, not its emergence, but its grumbling appendix carrying on as a result of the Scottish National Party getting its second biggest recent national vote. And of course, there is what's going to happen as a result of this election, which is, for all and practical purposes, a landslide that will give Boris Johnson a relatively free political hand, and a free political hand bereft also. There won't be any more legalistic interference. I think the courts will accept the result of this election in their decisions. And therefore, I'm going to ask Tim to begin with some reflections on the election. I will ask him some questions following that, and then we'll throw open the question to the floor. So, Tim Montgomerie, many thanks for coming, and we knew it was going to be a good occasion, but in fact, this is almost as good an occasion as the election in terms of the turnout, and I think that is very largely due to the fact that you're the speaker. So, Tim.
Well, thank you very much, John. Thank you, the Danube Institute. Thank you all for coming today. And John's introduction was far too generous, but I must, at the very least, repay the compliment, really, because what John didn't say was that when I was searching in the wilderness for some sort of way of helping the Conservative Party recover, I couldn't have asked for a better friend than John. John was then based in America, and he really opened his contacts book. We don't have contacts books anymore, we're all on our phones, but I think then it was a contacts book, and he introduced me to people really across the American movement. At a time really when the Conservatives weren't fashionable, when it was hard for us to find any doors opening to us, but John really helped me to establish what I was able to establish, and we've remained friends ever since. And wherever you go in the sort of political world, John seems to know people and people know John, and it's a remarkable thing. And the last time I saw him was last Wednesday evening, and John is looking fighting fit now, but since then he's not been so well, and he's missed, I think, I was literally in bed when the Conservative Party was winning the general election. And I don't know whether I look like I have an insufferable smile at the moment, but I have been smiling almost non-stop since 10 o'clock last Thursday. And this is even more of a confession than I'm about to make, but I think I've been drinking more or less non-stop since last Thursday as well. And probably, John, you wish you'd been well, but I suspect your liver has benefited from you not being around in British politics over the last few days. And it is, I am 49, and I've seen a few general elections, but this was the general election I am most pleased to have won. For me, it was the most important general election of my lifetime, and probably won't be surpassed. And before John asked me a few questions, I'll sort of briefly just give a few headlines for you as to why I think it really mattered. I won't try and talk for too long because I'm conscious I don't quite know what interests you in the audience most of all. So probably best if I don't speak for too long. But first of all, whatever your view of the great question of Brexit, and that is now resolved, Britain will leave the European Union. And as I was saying to someone a little while ago, I hope that means that Britain will be a happy neighbour to the European Union. In a way, up until now, we've been unhappy tenants. And we have been very unhappy tenants. This is not the end of our relationship with the European Union or Europe. I think there will be very significant investment by Boris Johnson in relationships, particularly bilaterally, with key European states. I think the French relationship will be significant, and I think this relationship with Budapest will be significant as well. Budapest and Hungary have been home, I think, for an awful lot of interesting early thinking on the limits of liberalism. And I think we're seeing that in the UK as well. So I hope there will be a special relationship with Hungary amongst other states. But why the election mattered whether you agree with Brexit or not, was because democracy matters. 3.5 years ago, the British people voted to leave the European Union. And as of last Thursday, when they voted, they were still inside the European Union. They voted in the general election. They voted, in the referendum in June 2016 to leave the European Union. At a subsequent general election in 2017, more than 80% of them voted for parties that said that they would honour the European election result. And still we found ourselves in the European Union. And I think if we hadn't have won last week, millions of people would have given up on democracy in the UK. They would have thought, what is the point of voting when actually the powers that be, the elites, the courts can overrule us? So we would have had people turn away from democracy and potentially worse, turn to extreme parties. So for me, whether you believe in Brexit or not, British democracy has reasserted itself. And I'm very proud of my country's democratic traditions. Our parliament is a little bit more modest than the parliament that you have here, a little bit smaller, but we have a tradition of parliamentary democracy, of being a democratic nation, exporting democracy around the world. And I didn't want us to be the place that, like too many other European states, voted to sort of slow down or stop European integration, but found that vote overruled. I think this is the first time that a nation has voted to say enough to Europe, and enough will mean enough. It was also a very important result because Jeremy Corbyn was not an ordinary Labour or left-wing politician. He was accused of anti-Semitism, and I certainly think it was true that within a lot of the Labour Party there was significant anti-Semitism. But also, I think he proved that never treat the voters as stupid. It's a golden rule in politics. But if you read the Labour Party's manifesto, promise after promise after promise was made. I think he didn't offer people 24 cans of Stella Artois and 20 free packets of cigarettes for Christmas. But I think, other than that, I think he made every kind of promise possible. And people are not stupid, and they knew that this was an undeliverable manifesto. And I think, just for the sense of prudent economics, it was a very important election. And I hope it will have a moderating influence around the world, actually, because I think up until now, Labour has presented itself as the largest political party in Europe. And I think the message was that going left-wing, going extreme, was a way of mobilising support and could be a way to victory. I think a lot of people will now revisit that. There is already some debate in America as to what this means for candidates like Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. And I hope it will just produce a more moderate Labour Party, because I'm a Conservative, but I'm also a patriot. I love my country. And when, at some point soon, the Labour Party will come into power, the Conservative Party is not going to be in power forever. I want that prospect to be a disappointment, but not terrifying. And up until last week, I was terrified at the prospect of Labour winning. I want there to be a sensible Labour alternative, because political parties, at their best, are partners as well as competitors. A political party will come in and accept a lot of what the other party did, and they will change other things. But you don't want constant revolution in politics, where one party undoes the others. You want each party to respect the other's wisdom. My third of 4th points is just to note one of, I think, the most interesting things happening in politics at the moment. And I know we have a few Australians in the audience, and John and I share an interest in Australian politics. And I've called it the Great Switcheroo. And I was there for the Australian election earlier this year, and I worked quite hard to try and help Tony Abbott keep his seat in a very prosperous part of Sydney. And it was not a successful effort, because what we saw and what we're seeing across a lot of the world is better off, richer parts of the electorate are not voting right-wing, not voting Conservative in the way they were. But the Australian Liberal Party, they're a Conservative party, kept power because of building up more support in Queensland, in areas which traditionally were Labour strongholds. The only reason Donald Trump is in the White House now is because Pennsylvania and Michigan and Wisconsin voted for him, while some other more prosperous parts of America, like Virginia, trended in the other direction. And in Britain, the Labour Party did win one seat last Thursday, a new seat, and that was Putney. I don't know how many of you know London, but Putney is a very nice part of Britain. The houses are very big, people are very wealthy, and Labour won that. But they lost seats throughout the north of England, old mining towns. They lost the seat that Tony Blair used to represent, Sedgefield, in the northeast of England. And I think this is not only an interesting phenomenon that I think is a global phenomenon and that will continue. I think it's very good for what we might call social justice and social harmony. Because when Blair and Bill Clinton and others were at the height of their powers, there was a big competition for the votes of middle-class voters. There was a focus on southern seats, which were traditionally sort of Tory, Labour, Liberal Democrat marginals. Now, if the Tory party is to stay in government, and if Labour is going to come back in government, both are going to have to win the hearts of working class voters. And so now there's going to be a competition in politics for people who really need government to look after them. There's going to be a competition for how does government help people who are lower paid, who have less good infrastructure, who need a safety net. And I think that not only is an interesting phenomenon politically that's changing the electoral geography of the advanced nations, I think it's actually very good for social cohesion as well. And that sort of brings me to my sort of final thought. And that is, takes me back here really to Budapest and some of the things that Prime Minister Orban has emphasized. And I don't agree with everything that Fidesz stands for, but I think the recognition that Fidesz and your Prime Minister here have stated that the nation matters and that globalization is often a threat to that is an incredibly important one. The fact was that a lot of the reason why those northern strongholds, previous northern strongholds of the Labour Party voted Conservative last week, was they looked at a Labour Party increasingly concentrated in London, and they saw a party that was more interested in ideas and people and concepts that had no relevance to them. They saw a party which probably thought a London Labour Party that had more in common with the party of socialists in Paris, or Christian Democrats in Berlin, or Democrats in Washington and New York. And really they stopped thinking that actually their primary loyalty wasn't to the people that they actually depended upon for their votes. They forgot that actually the jobs and the security and the hopes of people of Sedgefield and Blythe Valley and Workington and Wrexham and all of these other once red wall, rock solid Labour seats that are now blue, they thought that they could be taken for granted and they didn't matter and they could carry on with their internationalist, globalist ideas. Well, they're not thinking that this morning, or I hope they're not thinking that this morning, because the beginning of recovery is to have actually political parties that realise that charity and politics and good government begins at home. And that is now the challenge for my party, for the Prime Minister I'm very proud to serve in Boris Johnson. And I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Tim. That was terrific. Now, let me just ask a few questions. First, a few questions about the Tory party, which is, after all, the winner. In view of what you've said, you were a close observer, and indeed in earlier days a supporter in a way of what was attempting to be achieved by David Cameron in his leadership of the party. And there is such a thing as Cameronism, I think, and it implies something different from this election result. Could you just say a little something about where Cameronism stands now in the Conservative Party? What exactly was it in your view, and where does it stand?
I'm interested that you think I was a big supporter of David Cameron, John. John was asked by a former, a friend of ours, Ian Duncan Smith, former Tory leader, who held on his seat last week. David Cameron once said to Ian, who is a very good friend of mine, I used to work for him, he said to him, "Tim is at the top of my list of people I'm going to put who are at the top of my list of people for the House of Lords." And then he said, "Top of the list of people I will never put in the House of Lords." And that is because of this Conservative Home website, which actually was a constant thorn in his side, constantly urging him to offer a more balanced conservatism. But there are still parts, you're right, John, there are still parts of Cameronism that mean that the Conservative Party of Great Britain is, for example, different from the Republican Party in America. And so one of those issues is climate change. The Conservative Party in the UK is what we would call green, I suppose. It is much more relaxed about public spending. It is happy to invest in, for example, what American Republicans would call socialized medicine, National Health Service. It is tougher on immigration than David Cameron would be now. It is more interested in working class people than perhaps middle class people. It's very tough on crime. David Cameron was more relaxed about crime and wanted to look more at the causes of crime, whereas the Home Secretary that Boris Johnson has appointed is a very tough law and order candidate. So there are similarities and differences, but I don't know how many of here know, I'm sure there's an audience of you're very familiar with this, but there's this quadrant of politics where you can divide up into whether people are economically liberal or economically interventionist, or socially liberal and socially sort of conservative. And I think for a long time there has been this view that politics is divided into people who are liberal or conservative on those issues. And actually what has been the case is that we've had a left-wing and a right-wing party that dominated British politics that were accomplices, in the sense you had an economically liberal right-wing and you had a socially liberal left-wing, and they were really actually reinforcing each other. They were essentially parties of individual autonomy, one in the economic sphere, one in the cultural sphere, and neither were really building community or nation. And I think it's true of Fidesz, I think it's true of Donald Trump, I think it's true of Scott Morrison, I certainly think it's true of Boris Johnson. I think we are seeing the Conservative Party move into the sphere of cultural and economic solidarity, as I would call them. That I think it's still consistent with traditional conservatism. I think we're still the party that believes in the individual, but it's a greater idea of individualism. It's an idea of the individual where the individual prospers with good public services, strong family, strong community, a nation that sees them as the priority rather than perhaps an immigrant from abroad. And it's that sense of a better individualism, an individualism that has more in common with Catholic social teaching than with a sort of Ayn Rand individualism. I think that's what's being built.
Yes, thank you. Now, that leads directly, therefore, to the question about another conservative-ism, namely Thatcherism. And where does Thatcherism stand as a result of this? and also to what extent is the Conservative Party playing about with ideas which essentially risk coming into conflict not only with some established verities, but also with what I would say are the laws of economics. And over to you.
Well, I'm very frightened of talking about what Mrs. Thatcher might think of what's happening now when I'm sat next to a former speechwriter to Margaret Thatcher. And I don't know whether she's looking from above now, and if I'm struck by lightning, you'll know that I'm wrong. But I think she would be very pleased about the Brexit result. Now, this is a controversy. There are advisors like Charles Pole who would say that she would have supported staying in the European Union. I think you would think she would have supported leaving, and
that's right.
I certainly do. Her leadership ended with a speech in Bruges where she talked about rolling back, that Britain had not rolled back the frontiers of the state at home, only to see them reimposed at a European level. And she really issued marching orders to the Conservative Party, in my view, to deliver what we have now, or about to deliver, in the form of leaving the European Union. And so I think she would overall be very happy with the modern Conservative Party. And she was associated with economic liberalism and privatisation and cutting the state. But every politician exists in their own time. And the fact was that in 1979, the British state had grown far too big. Its tentacles were intruding into every part of national life. And she had to beat that back. But I think in her speech about the European Union, she was also saying something else, that the Conservative Party and conservatism wasn't just about economics, wasn't just about privatisation, it was also about the nation state and national identity. And I think some people who today regard themselves as Thatcherites, she would not recognise. I think they have looked at what she emphasised at a particular time in British history and have thought that that was what the sum of conservatism amounted to. And actually, I think conservatism is about economic enterprise, but it is also about a strong state that protects the weak, that ensures law and order, that ensures national defence, and it is also about a society beyond the state, that the most important institutions that give us life meaning, that help us grow as individuals, that educate, that civilise, that transfer welfare, are not from the state. They are the family. They are philanthropic organisations. They are the small business. They are community organisations. And I think what I hope we will see under this Boris Johnson government, that we'll be able to govern in a way we haven't had a Conservative government able to govern since 1992. 1992, we had a Conservative government which was elected with a very small majority. So this is the first time, really, in 25 years, we have a majority Conservative government that will be able to be a proper Conservative government. I hope what Boris Johnson will be a Prime Minister not just of economic conservatism, but of patriotic conservatism and cultural conservatism as well. And I hope, John, Mrs. Thatcher will approve of that.
Well, I tend to agree with you that she would. In fact, I think she would look particularly at some people who think of themselves as Thatcherites today, not as Thatcherites so much, but as accountants. And as accountants, she would have respect for them, but she wouldn't regard their conclusions as overriding everything else. And in fact, that, I think, is the history of her relationship with Lord Cockfield, whom she sent to the EU as a commissioner, and who played what was overwhelmingly, in her view, a positive role in relation to creating the single market, but which, and he generally had an extremely competent mind that applied itself very effectively to questions of tax. But when it came down to it, she felt that he simply didn't understand the deeper currents of politics, I think, and found his position on Europe to be one that neglected the interests of the country. I mean, I don't mean that in a hostile way. He just didn't. His mind didn't go in the direction that hers did there. Let me turn to a very specific question, one which may apply to the jobs you have now, and that is, what in practice, as concretely as you can argue, and you may not be able to argue too concretely at this point, what in practice are the policies in relation to the economy and society that you think this new majority, this control of the official agenda, the parliamentary and political agenda, will mean for in future? I mean, if you've got a different kind of Conservative party, and how united is that party? If you've got a different party, what specifically will be the different politics here?
Well, a few examples, and I think some of it is still to take shape. I don't think the Conservative Party, I'm always nervous when I'm in front of a television camera, but I shall try and be honest, is I don't think, and I think if Boris Johnson was here, he'd probably acknowledge this, is that I don't think the Conservative Party has done enough thinking yet, or hasn't certainly completed its thinking, as to what is the best answer to that question. I'm afraid it is not. A lot of our think tank community, for example, and I think this is a problem in London, is the think tanks used to be largely funded by rich individuals who were involved in Conservative politics because they believed in Conservative politics. And so the money was given to organisations like the Centre for Policy Studies and the Institute of Economic Affairs, and they were told to just get on and think big. And that happens less now because rich individuals have got a bad name. And I won't dwell on that because it's a sort of a sidetrack. But many of the think tanks now, much more of their money comes from businesses and companies. And those companies have tended to drive the think tanks to think an awful lot more about how to change the regulation of widgets and things that matter to them most of all. And so actually you've had a think tank community which I think has been much less productive in how it's constructed. And I think the same is true in Washington. But I'm not so familiar with the scene here, so forgive me if I don't comment on it. So I hope what we might see is a reorientation of what the think tank community does. And I hope perhaps some of those rich individuals who've been put off giving to think tanks will return to their task. But just very briefly, some concrete examples. The Conservative Party is still a Conservative Party. It wants to cut taxes, but the tax cuts that were proposed in the manifesto weren't going to go to businesses, they weren't going to go to rich individuals, they were going to go to the working person. They were tax cuts focused on lower income people. I don't know how many of you have travelled into Britain recently, and if you go to London, I think you find a city which is one of the best cities in the world. I think it is the best city in the world, but I am biased. But the quality of the infrastructure is very high. Go to the north, go to Birmingham, go to North Wales, and you find trains in the summer which break down without air conditioning. They're horrible. You find roads that are inferior. And it's going to be hard because infrastructure takes a long time to deliver. But there is definitely going to be a redirection of spending on infrastructure so that the railways and the roads of the north and of the Wales and rural areas start to compete with London. There'll be a huge investment in broadband and fibre optics, and the rollout will begin in the poorer parts of the UK. And I think it won't just be economic changes as well. And I've already sort of begun to refer to this, but most people in Britain think that if you are sentenced to life imprisonment, then it should mean something equivalent to life imprisonment. It shouldn't mean that you're on parole in 7 or 8 or 10 years. And I think the Conservatives will deliver on that agenda. It will be part of the cultural agenda. There'll be stricter controls on immigration. Immigration is very good for wealthier people who want cheap au pairs and cheap waiters and cheap employees, but it actually forces down the wages of the lowest paid. And so there will be more control of immigration, particularly at that level. And I think it's control that is most important to people. People are not against immigration, but they do not like the idea that anyone from the European Union could come into Britain whenever they wanted. And I think it was John Howard, and I look over to our Australian contingent to see whether I've got the exactly quotation right. But John Howard said, we should decide who comes into our country, how they come into their country, and when they come into our country. And that doesn't mean that you're a closed country. It means you can still be very welcoming to immigration. And Boris Johnson believes in immigration. He believes it's a net good. But we must control who comes into our country. And in future we will. And I think that will be one of the most important things we will deliver for that new set of voter for the Conservatives.
A slightly different question on the question of Conservative unity. A former colleague of yours, Harry Phibbs, has a very interesting article in Conservative Home the other day. He listed all of the major figures at the top of the Conservative Party, in the cabinet, in government, in politics, who had actually left politics more or less entirely in the last week. Or by degrees to the last week. They included the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, they included the former Justice Secretary, they included the former Home Secretary, and the list would go on. Of the, I think, 21 Conservative rebels, I think only 4 are now back in Parliament, and they're members in good standing of the Tory party. They've made their peace with the election result, and before it happened, in fact. And in general, because I think the Americans say personnel is policy. You can't really carry out a new policy with all of the same personnel because everybody knows they don't really believe in it. So would you like to talk a little bit about this major change at the top of the Conservative Party, in which a good third, at least, maybe more, of the Tory establishment, the so-called grandees, simply aren't there anymore?
Yeah, and it's a massive shift. And so, if we go back to 1997, when the Conservative Party lost to Tony Blair in Tony Blair's first big victory, the Prime Minister, the Conservative leader, was John Major. The Deputy Leader and Deputy Prime Minister effectively was Michael Heseltine. And the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the other most senior member of the government, was Ken Clarke. Those were the 3 most important Conservatives in the country at that time. And all of them last week urged voters not to vote Conservative in every seat. Now, that is the scale of really the shift that has taken place in the party, and the greatest manifestation of it. You had, that was the 1997 election, where John Major was the Conservative candidate, Tony Blair was the Labour candidate. Well, over the last few months, on the biggest issue of our time in the UK, the issue of our membership of the European Union, the two have been indistinguishable, haven't they? Yeah. Tony Blair and John Major taking exactly the same position. And it's this sense, I think, that the political class believed in a set of things for 40 years, and however people voted, they couldn't change that consensus. That sort of has been an anger bubbling away in British politics for a long time. It's been part of the disconnect. And it was an incredibly controversial thing that Boris Johnson did 2 or 3 months before the general election. But it was the most important thing he did, was when 21 Conservative MPs rebelled against his stance on the European Union, and there were former Chancellors of the Exchequer in there, people that were untouchable, supposedly. These were the grand big beasts of the Conservative Party. And Boris Johnson, with a stroke of his pen, threw them out, withdrew the whip from them and said, "You're no longer Conservative MPs." And the BBC was shocked. The media was shocked. This is not how you behave. This is not how you behave to people that regularly appear on the Today programme, which is the sort of the BBC's most important sort of flagship programme. And then a whole host of things happened. Boris, and this is where I am always nervous about cameras, but I'm going to say it anyway, is that there were things like the proroguing of Parliament. And forgive me if you haven't followed this closely, but a lot of things were done, including the suspension of Parliament, that people at the top of politics, including many of the people you've just named, John, thought were outrageous. That here was a British Prime Minister playing fast and loose with the rules. And the people previously at the top of the Conservative Party, people at the top of the media village, people in universities, people in bishops' palaces, they thought this was all outrageous. And they thought this was a party leader not playing by the rules. The people in Bishop Auckland and Wrexham and Sedgefield and all these other places that have just voted Conservative, they didn't see someone breaking the rules that had never suited them particularly or served them. They saw someone determined to implement the referendum result. And in expelling those 21, it was the most important thing I think Boris Johnson said. He said, when you vote for a Conservative government and you vote for a Conservative MP, you're going to get one. And you're going to get Brexit. And our loyalty isn't to people who've been in the Conservative Party for years. Our loyalty is to you. Our loyalty is to the referendum result. And it's very interesting how Westminster and the elite heard it one way as an outrageous thing, but people out there thought, good, my vote will count. And I'm sorry, some of those people are really good people. I hope a lot of them will come back now the Brexit issue is settled, because on a lot of the issues we've been discussing, infrastructure spending, the balance of the state, they're natural Conservatives. They should be in the Conservative Party. But they must come back now on the terms that the electorate have elected the Conservative Party on, not on the terms that they were trying to set themselves above the electorate.
Thank you. There is one group of people, of course, to whom this defeat has not applied. One of the most interesting things of the last 3 years has been the degree to which institutions, which might normally have been expected to be sympathetic to a government elected on a programme to carry out the decision of a referendum, have been on the other side, and passionately so. I include there the editors, for example, of several major papers. The Telegraph and the Sun and the Mail papers, they have been essentially critical, sometimes, but loyal to the Tory party. The Times, owned by Rupert Murdoch, as everybody always says, nonetheless has been one of the loudest no voices, and that has been reflected in its editorials and also in its choice of columnists. There are conservative columnists, but the majority of columnists on the paper were very strongly Remain. The Financial Times has kicked its bonnet over the moon in the way in which it is, it's become what some people call the Brussels Express. It's been passionately devoted to remaining. The Economist also. But the general feeling, and the BBC, as again you've several times in a sense implied, has been an engine of the argument for remaining in. There's been a great... will this now change? Because at the top of all the major social and cultural institutions, the new government and the new electorate is faced with what could be either a stubborn enemy, or it could be, in which case there would have to be some attempt to change things. A very delicate operation to change the leadership of cultural institutions, to influence them in a different direction. Or they could be make the decision, which in a sense is the one that's been made again and again in the past, in which the institutions which have been on the losing side say, well, we've been on the losing side. We think we may have been right, but nonetheless we have to accept that the nation decided to move in the opposite direction. We won't abandon everything we've ever said. We will continue to make critical points, but nonetheless we will no longer act as a deliberately obstructive force. This seems to be one of the biggest problems facing the new government.
It is, and I'm not going to pretend I have an answer to that, or certainly not a one that I'm happy to sort of discuss publicly just at the moment. But I think very little will change if these institutions are allowed to carry on without some sort of public policy change. And I'll give you an example why, is that, and I think this is certainly a problem in America too, I think it's a problem in Australia, is that the main media organizations are all headquartered in the big cities. And the big cities are not typical of the rest of the countries that they seek to serve. And the biggest, or one of the biggest predictors of how you would vote in the UK election last week was age. And so I think, I'm not quite sure what the tipping point is, but if you're under 24, 18 to 24-year-olds in Britain, 60% voted Labour. You know, the Tory party only had 20% of those young voters. You go to the other end of the age spectrum, over 55, and 60% are voting Conservative. Now, you may think that's a long-term problem for the Conservative Party, and perhaps it is. But the media organisations, who works for them? You know, it's largely young people who live in London. Go to the New York Times. Who works for the New York Times? Young people who live in New York. Who produces and powers the Hollywood tech, the Californian tech firms? It's young people living in San Francisco. The same is true of Hollywood. The people who populate our leading cultural institutions in the West are incredibly untypical of the electorates that they serve. Now, I think that's one thing for private sector institutions to organise themselves that way. That is what is right in a free society. But the BBC, and I don't know how many people here consume the BBC in different forms, but the BBC is paid for by a compulsory licence fee by every British citizen to provide a different kind of broadcasting, supposedly, public service broadcasting. But is actually the public service broadcasting from the BBC serving all of the public? Or actually, is it mirroring in its drama output, much more than its current affairs output, is it actually producing output that represents everybody? I have seen plenty of BBC dramas that, for example, look at the ills of big business. I have never seen a BBC drama that looks at the ills of the European Union or the United Nations. I have seen endless BBC dramas that show that the American system is sort of a corrupt, inward-looking philosophy. I have seen plenty of BBC dramas that paint the church as a place of hypocrisy and sin. I haven't seen the same BBC, supposedly a public service broadcaster, poking fun or analysing corruption in the environmental movement or, for example, I could give lots of examples. And if we're going to have a differently kind of financed public service operation like the BBC, I'd like it to operate differently as well. And so watch this space.
Thank you. By the way, I just add that the subsidised theatre, which in Britain is one of the glories of the country in many respects, is also true. What you say is also true of that. However, it's not quite that true. British theatre at the moment has one or two dramatists. I would say Richard Bean, and I would say the author of The House.
James Graham.
James Gray, who, the second, neither of them, I think, exactly conservatives. Of course, it's also got Tom Stoppard, but neither of them conservatives, who nonetheless produce plays which are plainly not just run-of-the-mill, standard issue left propaganda, but genuinely interesting, good works, which I think, the most reactionary conservative like myself can thoroughly enjoy. I just make that mark, and I think we should look at that area too, and it's because so much of the early fruitful ideas emerge from the theatre in certainly in the English-speaking world. Now, I think we should ask a couple of questions on Labour and a couple on the forthcoming Brexit negotiations, and then I think throw it open to the floor. So my question, first of all, on Labour is Labour entering the civil war? And if it does, should the Labour MPs who are moderate declare independence? Or will they?
Well, I just about understand the Conservative Party, and that's quite hard work, keeping up with it. I don't profess to understand the Labour Party, but it's a great problem, isn't it? I meant what I said earlier. I want the main opposition party to be a credible government in waiting. I'm a Manchester United supporter. I don't know how football people here, but if Manchester United played a very small team every week, we'd be rubbish. Well, in fact, we are rubbish now anyway, but that's another issue. But Manchester United are better because they play Arsenal, because they play Chelsea, because they play Manchester City. Everyone is a better when they play strong opposition. We all raise our game to that. And we will only have a good British government if we have a good British opposition. So I want the opposition to be strong. And Andy Burnham, the Labour mayor of Greater Manchester, was on the radio this morning, and he was saying, the BBC presenter kept saying, who are you going to back in this leadership contest? Who are you going to back? And he wouldn't answer, and rightly, I think, because he said the fundamental problem for the Labour Party is that we have, in the Labour Party, a university-educated, prosperous wing, and then we have this working-class wing, which is a bit smaller at the moment, a working-class, poorer wing, and at the moment they don't talk to each other. And that we are run by a group of people who worry about that side and don't think about that side. Now, I don't know how those two come together. I don't know whether they can. And I don't actually know whether they should in some ways. But that's what Labour have to resolve. And I don't know who should be the next Labour leader, but I have thought for a long time that the Labour and the Conservative parties have had lots of people in them who joined 30, 40 years ago and have stayed in the parties, even though the old left-right debates have been replaced by debates about supranationalism versus nationalism, localism versus centralism, liberalism versus conservatism. The size of the state isn't the only debate anymore, and yet our political parties have stayed in the same boxes. I think the Conservative Party has moved a lot more to acknowledge the underlying new realities, and I think the Labour Party has moved as well, but it's moved to the university, green, educated side, and hasn't really thought about whether that's enough for winning. And I don't know how they're going to resolve that, John, but that seems to me to be what they do need to resolve.
Yeah. Well, thank you. The next question is about Brexit, actually. Although we will leave the European Union, as you say, probably, I think, by the 31st of January. Nonetheless, this will be almost immediately after that, negotiations with the EU will open on the question of what are like to be, or is there going to be, but also what are the characteristics of some new free trade agreement between us. Now, obviously, you can't predict what's going to happen here, but there is an important question from a political standpoint, and that is, what is the least, assuming there will be not total agreement immediately, but there are things to be hammered out and arguments from both sides, what is the least that Boris Johnson can come back and present to the House of Commons and his party in those negotiations?
Gosh, that's a killer question. That's a huge question. Well, the news this morning is that the law is going to be changed in the UK to mean that that Britain has to leave the European Union at the end of next year. I think there was some suspicion and some belief that because he'd won a big majority, he might somehow have a bit more flexibility against the so-called hardline Eurosceptics inside his party, and he might therefore have more time for negotiation. I think he's sending the message to Brussels by this change to the law that Britain is going to leave the European Union. We'll leave the European Union at the end of January, but we are determined to get the trade deal or whatever by the end of next year. And I think behind that is probably quite a sensible understanding of how European negotiations work. Most things are not done until the last minute. So a lot of months are spent talking and positioning and dancing, and everyone taking a long time to not get very far. But it really is in the last few weeks that real negotiations happen. And you should notice I haven't answered your question yet. But I think by focusing negotiations in a tight period, which will be the case now because of the change in the law, I think it will force both sides to address what they really want. And I think that will mean certain issues, perhaps like fishing, and exactly what dynamic alignment, to use a technical expression, might mean in terms of regulatory alignment, might be put off. And what we will get, first of all, is more of a vanilla free trading arrangement to govern manufacturing. And other issues, perhaps like financial regulation, might be delayed as well. And so I think the Prime Minister is determined to honour what he said in the manifesto about the new relationship being sorted by the end of 2020. But I don't think that will mean that necessarily the whole of the new relationship is settled by the end of next year. I think the basics will be done, and I think that will largely be about goods and manufacturing goods, partly because of the implications for Northern Ireland. Other issues might be kicked into the slightly longer grasp. But I should say these issues are above my pay grade, so I'm giving a commentator's view in saying that, not necessarily the view of Her Majesty's government.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was absolutely marvellous range across all of the issues concerned with the election. And now, because I'm conscious that there are people in the audience who've got different interests to my own, I wonder if I could ask for people. I see no shortage of hands, but could I first ask, oh yes, Melissa, you've got, wait until you get the microphone. Could I ask Mark to ask the first question? Don't worry, your questions will all be answered. Mark Higgy.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Tim, for a terrific presentation. And I like many things in what you said, but the line about happy neighbours as opposed to unhappy tenants, I think, is a particularly good and memorable one. And congratulations also on your role in the equally happy re-election of the Morrison government in Australia earlier this year.
Well, I'm afraid the only place I campaigned you lost, so I'm not sure whether
well,
I should.
The overall result was very good. But But on Labour, another distinguished recent speaker to the Danube Institute, Andrew Roberts, has made the point that despite the very happy outcome, we should all be worried about the fact that 30% of the electorate voted for such an extremist as Corbyn, and touched on a lot of those cultural issues you were talking about, John, and what can Boris Johnson do about the left's dominance of the civil service and the educational establishment and the BBC. But I just mentioned I thought the best tweet in reaction to Labour's problems over the weekend was somebody who said that Arsenal was down 3-0 but was winning the argument. But can I just ask one question? That's about Scotland. Where do you think that's going to go with Sturgeon's push for Indy Ref 2? And does the union survive?
Tim.
Well, you're quite right to raise the issue of Scotland, which I probably should have covered already earlier. And you can remind me of these words, and perhaps I'm being complacent, but and I think vigilance is needed, and I think Boris Johnson is right to tell Nicola Sturgeon, the leader of the Scottish Nationalists, that he has a mandate as well as she has a mandate. And the Tory party, one of the reasons the Tory party won last week was we've had a terribly volatile time in the UK. Every time we switched on the 6 o'clock news, you've seen upheaval in Parliament, crisis vote. How many times have you heard crunch vote in the British Parliament on Brexit today? You know, there's been so many of them, and they're also inconclusive. And we have had an election we had a referendum on Scotland in 2014, a general election in 2015, a European referendum in 2016, a general election in 2017. And now the people are tired of elections. And one of the promises that Boris Johnson made was 4-5 years of stable government, no more big elections, no referenda. And so, although Nicola Sturgeon wants another referendum on Scotland, the British people overall have voted for stability, I think. And although she led the SNP to be the party that won most votes in Scotland, it was, I forget the percentage.
45%.
45%. 55% voted for unionist parties, which is actually the mirror of how the Scottish independence vote was carried in 2014. 55% voted to stay in the UK, 45% voted to leave. So I think it's fair to say the SNP will press for a referendum, but I think it is perfectly sensible for Boris Johnson to say, I have a mandate as well, and give us a chance. See what we do. Will we invest in infrastructure across the whole country? Will we be a different kind of Conservative government than you've traditionally thought? And I think that will help Scotland stay in the UK. I also think that the Scottish people have just witnessed how difficult it is to end a 40-year relationship that Britain has been in. Britain has been a member of the European Union since the early 1970s. Well, the union between England and Scotland is over 300 years old. It's a much deeper, more subtle, culturally more entwined relationship. If you think the European divorce was difficult, we've just had an education in that, how difficult would be a divorce between Scotland and England? And ultimately, I think the UK, I think the Scottish English relationship, Scottish English-Welsh relationship, is going to be okay. I'm more worried about Ireland, and Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland, where I think that the demographics in particular are more concerning if you're a unionist.
By the way, just a codicil on your last point, I agree with you generally. These things worry me, but there was one very good sign out of Northern Ireland this time, and that was the sign that both communities are beginning to be tired of tribal politics, and there is a move towards what I would call a unifying central position. Now, that doesn't mean to say there aren't important divisions, but nonetheless, the result in a couple of seats shows that there are a lot of people who would like to see some kind of centrist politics emerge there. Yeah. Next question. Yes, gentleman right at the back.
Thank you very much. My question would be, which also goes to probably equally to Mr. O'Sullivan, that you previously mentioned that this government has some parallel with Thatcherism. And to what extent do you think this parallel exists? Because the way I see, with very different tools, very, very different tools, but both political movements targeted blue-collar working-class voters to elevate them to the middle class. And they had a very socially conservative background. So what do you think on the long term, also to a prospect to America, which there is something similar, is the conservative future lies with the working class, and then where does that leave Labour? Thank you.
I certainly think that the working class voter is now going to be a much more important part of the Conservative coalition. But I think it will have to, you still have most better off people voting Conservative as well. At the moment, the Conservative Party has sort of a fairly broad coalition. And one of the tensions, I think, will be over the coming years is, I live in Salisbury in England, and Salisbury has its own problems, and it's like lots of places outside of London. In a way, the big issue in the UK isn't north versus south or rural versus town. It's everybody against London. London is seen as London is this huge success, I've sort of already suggested, but it sucks everything into it. So our most talented young people, whether they're from Bury or Salisbury or Cardiff, they go to London, because London is where it's at. It has the best nightclubs, it has the best sport, it has the best job opportunities, it has the best income. The British government is there, our civil service, all our great public sector institutions. It's all concentrated in London. And at least in America, you have New York and Washington and San Francisco and Los Angeles and Dallas, and you have a few major cities. Germany has Berlin, but it also has Hamburg and Frankfurt, and there's more diversity in London. In some ways, a little bit like France, I think, with Paris, that they are too dominant in their economies. And the challenge, I think, for the Conservatives is to be the party, and this is something very interesting for Boris Johnson as the former mayor of London to now be presiding over. How does he ensure that there is a settlement on infrastructure spending, on education, whereby the people, the Britain that is beyond London feels that it has a future? And I think the Conservative Party does not want to not be the party of London, but I think its future will be in fighting for those communities, and that's nearly every community, that feels that it's in a race against London. And I think that's probably a global phenomenon. Donald Trump has certainly been riding this tension. How, in a world where conglomeration, I can't even say the word, conglomeration in the major cities is seemingly the way of a lot of economic future, how do you keep the rest of the country going? So I'm not sure that's a direct answer to your question, but I think it's my best way of answering it.
Well, I will take up your invitation. On Tim's point, I think what he's describing is a real thing. It's an evil, actually, but it's a post-war thing much more. If we go back to look at someone like novelist J.B. Priestley in his memoirs, he describes how people from Yorkshire cities and the Lancashire cities, and when they were going to the continent, to Paris, say, they didn't necessarily feel they had to go through London. They went from Hull and from ports along the East Coast. And I think it's a number of things since the Second World War have resulted in the fact that talent is drawn much more than it used to be from the lesser cities to the centre, and of course, therefore, the lesser cities don't have the very strong political leadership that they used to have. Joe Chamberlain dominated British politics for about 20 years. He divided. He destroyed and divided two major parties. He was a major figure. He was a Birmingham, a political boss. There was a famous boss in Liverpool, no one's heard of now, called Alderman Salvage. And the British cabinets and the Tory side were always worried about what Salvage would do about particular policies, particularly on Ireland. So that's a major change. It may be that in Scotland that's been reversed, but because of devolution, but it hasn't been reversed in England, and we have to think about how to do it. On the larger point, I think Tim and I, you and I, have been among a small group of people who've been arguing that the case for moving towards a more balanced conservative electorate was a strong one, particularly since, and this is history which everybody should know but doesn't, the Conservative Party relied very, very strongly on the working class vote from about the 1880s onwards. The Conservatives, right the way through to about 1960, that half of their vote came from the working class. That represented a third of working class votes. But if they hadn't have had it, they wouldn't have won a single election. That is why Conservative politicians, right through the period, have never pursued class interest as such, but the reconciliation of class interests, because they were an actual national party. And I think in the recent debates which have been held, people like you and I have been pitted against, I would say, the Cameroonian intellectual theory. Lord Finkelstein is one of its leaders, which saw the working class as such a declining force as they saw it, that we shouldn't shackle ourselves to it. We should pursue a larger middle class and upper middle class constituency. I don't think that was ever going to work, because that constituency was not sympathetic to our overall aims, particularly as they now seem to be emerging.
You used to call it Curtis Land. Was that what you used to?
Yeah, that's right. I called it Richard Curtis Land. Yeah. From the movie Four Weddings and a Funeral and Love Actually and the rest of it. Very, very nice people who swore horribly. Anyway, so that I think is my argument, that we're rediscovering a truth which has become, which we've forgotten, and if we should now remember it always. And it doesn't mean pursuing a class interest here. It means ensuring that all class interests are taken into account, and as far as can be done, reconciled. So thank you. Next question. The gentleman right at the back first, you see, and then two questions.
David Gerestesh from Central Europe Trust. We were founded in 1989 by Nigel Lawson. I'm interested in the economic impact of Brexit. I think there's been some research done indicating an estimated something like 8% decline in GDP over roughly a 10-year period, if I remember the numbers right. I'm curious if you agree with that, and if so, what can be done to prevent that from happening? Thanks very much.
Should take that straight away.
Yes,
sir. No, I don't agree with those projections for a number of reasons. First of all, a lot of things have been said about what Britain would experience even after we voted to leave the European Union that haven't come true. I think the British economy is more resilient than a lot of people think, partly because of the reforms that Margaret Thatcher made. A lot of the forecasts that were made for the Eurozone were always very positive, but I think they underestimated the dysfunctionality at the heart of the European Union. And I think fundamentally the European Union is a flawed project. It's why I wanted Britain to leave, partly why I wanted to leave, is I think 27 member states on different political and economic cycles are going to increasingly struggle to agree on the kind of reforms that are needed to keep a continent like Europe competitive in the years ahead. I think Britain is about to escape that dysfunctionality. Not completely, because we're still going to be neighbours and we're still going to be integrated. But I think there will be a large degree of alignment on existing economic sectors. And I think some Eurosceptics will be disappointed by that in the treaty that emerges from the next few months of negotiations. But there are a number of industries which Britain is incredibly well placed in, future industries such as life sciences, that I think Britain now has the opportunity to, these are not necessarily well regulated yet, or the regulatory approach to them is immature. We will now be able to regulate them in our own way to suit our own needs. And I think that will be a very significant competitive advantage for the UK in the years to come. Different measures say whether we are at the 5th or the 6th or the 7th largest economy in the world, but what has been true, whether it's been in multilateral or bilateral trade negotiations, is that Britain has not been represented at the front table of those talks. So we have had to sit on the sidelines when a country like New Zealand will be able to speak at, for example, World Trade Talks and argue for its lamb industry. But we will have to listen to the European representatives, largely talking about manufacturing at trade talks, which is where the European heartland is. But Britain, which is largely a services-driven economy, our voice and our concerns on those issues are never heard. Well, that's about to change. When we start negotiating trade treaties, when we are represented in global fora, there will be someone representing Britain 100%. And so I don't say the adjustment's going to be easy, and I suspect there will be transitional costs. And Boris Johnson himself has sort of likened it to, I don't know you, apologies to those of you who prefer Adidas to Nike, but the swoosh, the Nike swoosh, goes down a little bit and then shoots up. And he says that's what he thinks Brexit will be like. There's going to be an adjustment. But ultimately, I think because of the English language, because of London, because of our university sector, because of a whole range of things, Britain's going to be okay. And I think Britain will be very strong in the years ahead. And the challenge on that GDP number that you're perfectly reasonable for you to quote is one of the great moments of the European election, of the European referendum campaign, was when one academic was talking about GDP taking a hit. And someone at the back shouted out, and I won't repeat the exact words that they used, but it's not our GDP, it's your effing GDP. And what they were saying was, yes, you're growing, London's growing, but my high street's declining. I've got less security in my own affairs, and I want a different kind of economic settlement, not a continuation of what we've had. And I think summing all this up, and this was something David Cameron did as well as Boris Johnson, was his the slogan of the Brexit campaign wasn't set us free, it was take control. David Cameron stopped using freedom as the central message of the Conservative Party, and it was security. And I think there is a willingness amongst a lot of voters. They don't want the control and the totalitarianism, Corbynism. They want aspiration, but actually they're willing to trade a little bit of growth and a little bit of maximisation for less growth if they have a bit more security and a bit more order. And I think that's a sensible trade-off. And the challenge for those of us who have the privilege of being government is to ensure that there is still enough growth to ensure we have enough resources to share around. But the old measures of how an economy succeeds, I think, do need a bit of revisiting as well.
Next questions. Oh. There's a question there, and then I think a question from Charles behind.
My name is Henry Scullion. It sounds like you spent a lot of time in America. Now that Britain's untethered from the European Union, which side of the Atlantic do you think it will end up? And what are the criteria for getting there? It sounds like Brexit is a mix of politics, economics, and ideology. What are the factors that will decide where the country ends up?
Well, I used to spend a lot of time in America. I haven't been back since Trump was elected. I don't know whether that means anything or not. But I have not supported leaving the European Union to become the 51st state of America. You know, I want British democracy back. I don't want us to have traded some subservience to Brussels to become subservient to Washington. I'm a very proud British citizen, as I'm sure people here are proud Austrians or Hungarians or all sorts of Australians. I want Britain to set its own path in the world. And personally, and we were at a dinner, John and I, last week with Norman Lamont, and Norman Lamont, the former Chancellor of Exchequer, he thinks I'm a bit too much like a socialist sometimes in my attitudes to the size of the state, which some of you might find shocking if you think, oh, he thinks I'm a socialist. But I actually quite like, personally, a lot of the European model in terms of welfare and social order. And I think there is sort of a slightly sort of bizarre, perhaps, consequence of us leaving the European Union is, I think, we will be less European Union, but more European in some ways. I think this rebalancing of our economy, this investment more in regional infrastructure, as a party representing the working classes of the North now, I think the idea that we are going to have a bonfire of workers' rights is for the birds. I believe that the scare tactic that the Labour Party used throughout the campaign, that we were going to somehow sell off the NHS, our National Health Service, to the Americans, was a scare story. I don't know any senior Conservative who wants that. They know it would be electoral suicide. So I think we're going to be a country independent of the European Union, but I think our tax regime will probably be quite American in incentivizing entrepreneurship and people at the top. I think we will be more open in free trade than I think the European Union has been. I think the European Union trade policies and attitudes towards Africa are indefensible on many goods. I hope that's something that we will change. But I think in a lot of the way our economy and social service provision is constructed, will be much more recognisably European than American.
Good. Thank you. Charles.
Thank you, Charles Kovacs. Since we're on the economic topics, I'd like to ask you about the Prime Minister's statements that once the UK is out of the EU, it will be free of all these regulations and directives, the basis for while remaining in some way with some kind of a trade agreement with the EU. But that means usually compliance with all kinds of regulations regarding labor, regarding environment, a whole range of things which are actually almost the foundation of European protectionism, EU protectionism. And do you think that he was serious when he said that the UK will cut loose from this? And if so, where's it going to go with regards to the EU agreement? Will it be a straight trade agreement or still subject to all the limitations in the many chapters on regulations?
Well, the Prime Minister is always serious whenever he says anything, so he was serious about that as well. This is not my area of responsibility, and this is above my pay grade, so just for the record, as I look directly at the camera, I'm speaking in a personal capacity at this point, but a little bit, I think, in my answer to David's question, I think there will be quite limited regulatory separation from existing European regulations in how Britain is currently regulated and how Europe is currently regulated. I think the differences will grow over time, particularly in terms of the regulation of new sectors, of an emerging economic, markets. I think there will also be a much more intelligent immigration policy, which is one of the most important things that I think motivated the vote to leave the European Union. And rather than the current system whereby anybody from the European Union can enter Britain, there will be a real premium on skilled, educated and sort of sectors where there are shortages. And I think that will serve the UK economy very well. And immigration is one of the most important regulations of all in certain respects. So the alignment, I think, will be quite close on where we currently stand. But I think it will be the flexibility in terms of the future, and particularly future sectors, where the real economic opportunities for Britain exist. And services sector, and I think one of the things that most annoyed a lot of Britain's people when we were trying to renegotiate our position with the European Union before we left, Angela Merkel used to consistently say, the freedom of movement is a fundamental European principle, and we're not really willing to compromise on it. Well, freedom of services, which was the most important freedom for the UK economy, was never completed, often because of Berlin's resistance. So it was often that European principles seemed to be unfairly applied. Well, now Britain in the services sector, which really is what matters to us as an economy, has the opportunity to chart much more of our own way in how we regulate the City of London, and how that means we can take advantage of relations with Asia and the other fast-growing parts of the world. So outside of manufacturing, existing manufacturing regulation, that's where the action will be.
Good. Thank you. A question, there, and then one there. Was there another question here? No. Those two questions. And I think perhaps I can get some guidance from about the timing. Are we coming close to to our time? No. Okay. Okay. Sorry. Anyway, those two questions.
One thing I should say is I should be in John's hands, but I'm happy to stay afterwards, and I'm not in a rush, and happy to talk to individuals afterwards if people have questions as well.
So a question was there, and a question was there. Good.
Yeah. Hi, my name is Eugene Haller. Congratulations on your win.
Thank you.
And from what I've understood, what you were saying, that Boris Johnson is a law and order prime minister, and that the Conservatives are more for law and order. Is that correct? Right?
Yes.
Also, you don't want to be a third wheel to the United States. That's another thing that you mentioned. All right. But in saying that, you right now have an individual that, against all law and order, is imprisoned in your country. And his name is Julian Assange. And I'd like to know how the Conservative Party is going to deal with this, with his imprisonment.
Who, sorry?
Julian Assange.
Oh, Julian Assange, sorry.
Yeah. Okay. Good, thank you. And the question at the back.
My name is Peter Uivari from Fidelitas. and I would be interested in your opinion concerning the situation in Northern Ireland. Economically, Northern Ireland is very much linked to Ireland, and how do you value the risk of a reheating of the conflict between separatists and unionists in Northern Ireland? Thank you.
Well, on Julian Assange first, this is a matter now for the British judicial system. It's not a political judgment. Ultimately, I think there can be an appeal to the Home Secretary, and then it does enter the political realm. But the issue now is, I think the allegations made against him from Sweden have now been dropped. Probably finally, although I think some of the women involved in those allegations are appealing against the decision by the Swedish prosecuting authorities. So the issue now is as to the extradition to the United States and Julian Assange's handling of stolen confidential material. And I think it will be judges that will make the first decision on that in law. And but ultimately, if a decision is taken on him being extradited to the United States, there is a possibility of appeal to the Home Secretary, but we're not at that stage yet. To Peter on Northern Ireland, I think one of the reasons why I support, one of the many reasons why I support the rapid, the hope that we will get a rapid move to the final phase with the trade agreement is I think the current arrangement, the interim arrangement as set out in the withdrawal agreement, does pose problems of really a line down the Irish sea between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK that could be administratively and bureaucratically quite awkward. And although I think the Democratic Unionist Party, the Unionist Party in Northern Ireland, have perhaps overplayed their cards in recent years, I think their worries about the agreement that have been reached had some validity. And so the sooner we move to a long-term, clearer relationship between the UK and the rest of the European Union, the better. And I think what John, on your wider point about the possibility of a return to violence, I think if the trade relations are handled well, in the way that I hope that they will, I think John's point about the emergence of some non-sectarian parties is interesting. There is no appetite or wish in Northern Ireland for any return to any kind of hostility. The occasional, and we had a very sad murder of a journalist in Derry earlier this year. These are carried out really by very fringe groups now. There is still vestiges of the IRA and a lot of sort of mafia-style activity in Northern Ireland, organised crime, but it is not a violence or anything of the kind that we've seen in the Troubles in the past. And so good statecraft should easily be able to avoid a return to violence. So without there being any cause for complacency, I'm optimistic we can avoid it.
Can I just add to that, Tim, because there is an aspect of this which is very encouraging indeed. The beginnings of the change, the rapprochement between the EU and Britain, and therefore the result of the election, which reflected that, was the meeting between Boris and Leo Varadkar. That went very much better than anyone had expected, particularly on the Irish side. The meeting established a close and friendly relationship between the two prime ministers. And I can't read Leo Varadkar's mind, obviously, but everything I've heard from friends in Ireland suggests that he completely changed his view of Boris on that occasion and decided he was dealing because the image of Boris in Southern Irish politics has been an extremely hostile, even contemptuous one, as a kind of silly-ass fool. And to some extent, Boris is to blame for this, because he creates a kind of comic persona, which it'd be foolish to mistake for the reality. But apparently, Varadkar came out of the meeting with a completely different point of view, and now Anglo-Irish relations have taken a really serious upward tick, and everybody wants that to continue. And if that continues, it's hard to see if the problems in Northern Ireland can get worse, because the problems in Northern Ireland were always watered by bad Anglo-Irish relations. So another question, because we still have a little time. Oh yes, Melissa. Anyone else, by the way? No? No, good.
Inside job.
And a gentleman here too after her.
What will the election impact, what will this election's impact be on the decision by the British government to deal with Huawei, in light of the article that just came out that the Chinese seem to be putting pressure on the Germans on their decision to not include Huawei, and so they're saying, well, maybe we don't need your German cars. So what's the likelihood of what Boris will do in Parliament?
And the gentleman here.
Hi, my name is Gabor Molnar, and towards the end of this presentation, for which thank you very much, I was surprised to not hear one word during this whole conversation, which is populism. And I'm just trying to understand if there's any substance to claims of populism, or a parallel between populism and blue-collar conservatism or not, or whether this is just a phraseology that is being used by the press.
Oh, that's a good question. How long have you got for an answer to that one? What I'd say about this is that I think in a lot of the discussion about populism, the focus is always on the, if you like, the populist politician. So Mr. Orban, Mr. Farage, Mr. Johnson, Mr. Trump. These are the people that the media focus on, and I think you can therefore think of populism as perhaps something that would pass when these personalities pass. But I think if we're trying to understand populism, our focus shouldn't be on the people on the stage, but on the people in the audience listening to them. And why are people voting for Boris and Victor and Nigel and Donald? And those questions aren't asked enough. And so whatever populism is, it isn't really about any of the people on the stage. It is about long-term trends in economics and culture that are changing how people ally themselves. And I think with it, John and I, we're not on the same side of every question, are we, by any means. I was told off, I think the last time I was in Budapest by John, because I was giving an explanation of what I thought conservatism was, and one of the things I said was optimism, and Boris is not. And I was told that certainly wasn't a conservative trait by John, but that's another question. But I don't want to give the idea that we agree with the other. But where I think we agree, and I think we've been vindicated, is on what John was just talking about, was this working class space being an essential component of conservatism, and some of our opponents have said that this is a diminishing group of people because the trends in society is more of people being university educated. There's a big of that. But actually, I think if you look at some of the changes in technology, some of the implications of global trade, a lot of people, whether you're working class or middle class, are facing much more insecurity. the level of change that exists in society and the economy is growing. And I think in a period of uncertainty, that I think it's the uncertainty that drives populism. And so dealing with that is going to be a full-time job for governing classes for a very long time to come. And so we all have our different ideas of what populism means, but I would argue that it's the job of managing rapid change and uncertainty is going to be full-time and long-lasting, and it means that what we are currently experiencing in terms of this populist revolution is not a temporary thing. It's probably the new permanent. And at the moment, it's only really influencing the developed world, but the developing world, as you know, they've been benefiting very largely at the moment from the decline of manufacturing industry in the West, but technology is soon going to mean that they will have had a very short period with manufacturing wealth. And when their changes happen, they will be facing their changes often without any kind of developed welfare state or education sector to retrain their workforce. So the populist wave, when it hits the developing world, is going to be even larger in its ramifications, which is not an optimistic thought. So perhaps John was right all along about pessimism. On Melissa's issue, I can't comment on the specifics of what the British government might do, but and I'm not a 100% fan of Donald Trump, but I think the single most important thing that he is doing is standing up to China. I think China is a huge bully, and the trade stance that Donald Trump is taking, this is not a friendly power. Look at the way it treats its minority Muslim citizens. Look how it treats any dissent. We had a footballer at the weekend, an Arsenal footballer, Mesut Ozil, some of you may have seen it, a Muslim by background, and he complained about the Chinese government's treatment of minority Muslim Uyghur people. Chinese television cancelled that afternoon's broadcast of the Arsenal game. And for those of you who know British football, the worst thing of all, they replaced it with a Spurs game, which is the worst way of annoying Arsenal fans in the North London rivalry. The American basketball authorities have faced the same thing when one player dared to criticize Chinese human rights issues. So international solidarity between Western nations against China is absolutely vital, because this is not a state that respects freedom or norms, and whatever the decision on Huawei, we have to be tough and we have to be united to stop this bullying, because that's what it is. China is the biggest bully in the world at the moment.
Thank you. Are there any final questions? Tim, I think you have exhausted them.
I've exhausted my throat, I think, as well.
So I want to end the proceedings. I want to begin by saying that I'm not completely pessimistic. My view has long been the conservative principle is all bad things come to an end. But I think you have given a wonderful mixture of wisdom and entertainment today. I think we've had, how long, about an hour and a half, in which we've been questioned in every conceivable aspect of the recent election, and I think you have been persuasive and informative and interesting on all of those matters. I think it has to be a difficult topic, because everybody can sense, in a way they could sense, I think, after 1945, 1979, 1997, that although this is a conservative government remaining in office, it seems astonishingly like a new government taking power, as if it had been in opposition. And that is, that gives it the sense of being historic occasion. I also think the whole atmosphere has somehow become calmer and more amicable. The sense that there's going to be a break is no longer seen as quite the way it has been for 3 years, as being a break based on hostility, anger, isolation, and whatever. It's seen as being a measured step which can be reconciled with the interests of our former European partners and most of the people in this room represent. So you conveyed that feeling, I think, extremely effectively. That's an important part of the achievement today, and I'd like to thank you very much indeed.